So I want to say at the outset, I got this book here. Listen, they made me do it. I didn't want to, and it's like 5 pounds. And you don't have the one with the pictures in it. But you can blame it on General Marshall for having a resume like this, And my publisher and agent, who I started out with a shorter proposal, but they ended up saying, do pretty much all of it. So I did it. Yeah, you can't do it with him. So George Catlett Marshall, remembered, if at all, today by most people as the man with a plan, the Marshall Plan, of course. Not to be confused with George Preston Marshall, the former owner of the Washington Redskins. During a bitterly contested divorce, Preston Marshall's wife complained to the judge, "I married a man without a plan." So, when George C. Marshall, as Secretary of State, was spearheading what was called it was a historic European Recovery Program, later known as the Marshall Plan, through Congress, Clark Clifford, President Truman's advisor, recommended that the plan be called the Truman Plan. And at the time, Truman's approval numbers were in the tank. And Truman responded, "If I sent that plan up to the Hill with my name on it," and these were his words, "it'll quiver a couple of times, go belly up and die." Even the worst Republican, he said, would vote for the plan if Marshall's name were attached to it. And he was right. By the middle of the 20th century, Marshall was the most respected public figure in America. It's hard to believe, but that's true. As early as 1918, during the Great War, he had risen to prominence, certainly within all of the Army and a lot of the public, risen to prominence by planning and executing a brilliant nighttime movement, 600,000 American troops, putting them in place to fight and win the decisive battle that ended, the First World War. And General Pershing, who was in charge of all of the American troops in France, was so impressed by Marshall's performance that he made him his own personal aide after the war and his personal chief of staff. And during the Second World War, when Marshall was chief of staff of the entire Army, most of you know, he organized, he supplied, he trained from almost less than 200,000, an army of more than 8 million men and women. He was the dominant voice on matters of Allied strategy, Allied grand strategy, and the deployment of troops throughout the world. Right after, literally the day after he retired from the Army, Truman sent him to China, spent a year in China, trying, failing, to end the Civil War and to form a coalition government between the communist, Mao Zedong's communist Chinese and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. Lots of luck on that one. And then, as Secretary of State in 47 and 48, pushed through the Marshall Plan, laid the groundwork for NATO, oversaw the Berlin airlift. In 1948, he famously lost his temper in the White House, in a showdown in the White House, showdown in the Oval Office, over Truman's decision to recognize the new state of Israel. President of the American Red Cross for a year. And then Truman called upon him again, the last time, this time to be Secretary of Defense shortly after the outbreak of the Korean War. And in that job, he helped rebuild the army that had been depleted since after the Second World War. And he oversaw, with surprising reluctance, and I'd like to talk more about that, the relief of General Douglas MacArthur. And then he retired in 1951, but then he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. So the sheer sweep of Marshall's 50-year career, soldier statesman under 10 presidents, is truly breathtaking. So I can't possibly cover the accomplishments, the setbacks, the mistakes he made during that time. But so I want to concentrate on two themes. And the first is Marshall's interior life, his inner life, to the extent I could dig it up. And then the second two is character. And I was able to develop these themes through, I think, an avalanche of correspondence that was devoted was provided to the Marshall Museum in Lexington, Virginia, in recent years, donated by the family in recent years to the Marshall Museum, and also to a box of documents, box of correspondence that. Plus a battle map that was under a bench in a Northwest Virginia farmhouse, or Northwest Massachusetts farmhouse up on the Connecticut River, that was lent to me for several months. So Marshall's interior. Marshall's described by most writers as coolly impersonal. Austere, stoic, aloof, as if he had no feelings or was less than, a whole person. But when he was unmasked in the presence of his family and friends, it turns out he led a rich inner life, a life that found completion in his relationships with his two wives, a precocious young girl I want to talk about, and a headstrong stepson, and just a handful of intimate friends. But Marshall met his first wife when he was in his senior year at the Virginia Military Institute, also located in Lexington, Virginia. It was the year that he was first captain of the entire cadet corps at VMI, and this woman that he ran into, her name was Lily Carter Coles, and she was a stunning woman, tall, almost as tall as George. He was tall for his age, not that tall today. Full-bosomed, narrow corseted waist is a great photograph. She was witty, full of fun, adventurous. Marshall fell in love with her within a few weeks. And on their wedding night, he fell in love with her, and he risked demerits. He risked his position as first captain by violating the VMI rules and seeing her at nights and evenings in the little house where she lived. Is still there, just beyond the VMI limit gate in Lexington. On their wedding night in 1902 at the Willard in Washington, he learned that Lily could not risk pregnancy due to a congenital heart condition. And though they were a childless couple, exchanged dozens, if not hundreds of letters during their 25 years of marriage. Virtually all of them have been lost or destroyed. I suspect they were destroyed. But But one survived. It's at the Marshall Library, and it was written in 1917 when Marshall was over in France during the war. And it was a letter from Marshall to Lily. And taking into account the euphemisms and the mores of the day, I concluded that the letter reveals intimacy of a sexual nature, in case anybody was wondering. In 1927, Lily survived a dangerous operation to remove an infected thyroid gland that was aggravating her heart condition. Dangerous operation. She survived, and days after the operation, she was seated at her desk at the Walter Reed Army Hospital, where the operation took place, and she was writing a letter to her mother, and her heart stopped. And the last word she wrote in this letter was George. When Marshall learned shortly after of her death, his legendary reserve escaped him. And that precocious girl I mentioned a moment ago, her name was Rose Page. She visited him after the funeral, and Marshall and Lily had befriended Rose when she was only 8. And at the time of the funeral, she was 16, and she wrote about it. She actually wrote a book later. And she wrote that George Marshall's voice was barely audible, on the verge of breaking, and he confessed to her, called her Rosie. Rosie, I'm lonely, so lonely. And he wrote a letter. He wrote a letter to Pershing. Pershing by then was his best friend and mentor. He wrote to Pershing that he felt lost, unable, doubted he could face the future. And at the end of the letter, though, he wrote, "I will find a way." Of course he did. So several months later, he found himself in rural Georgia. He was appointed head of the academic program at the Fort Benning Infantry School. And it gave him an opportunity to assess and evaluate and train dozens of the Army officers who would become generals in the next war. And Marshall wrote or said that for him, Fort Benning was magical, transformative, and it gave him all outdoors in which to love to ride and hunt and fish. In 1929, Marshall was standing in front of a fireplace at a friend's very elegant house in the nearby town of Columbus, Georgia. And that's a mill town that's on the Chattahoochee River, bordering Alabama. Handsome woman entered the room. She was introduced to George. Her name was Katherine Boyce Tupper. And they struck up a conversation, and Marshall was immediately impressed by her striking presence, the confident way she carried herself, and her voice, the voice of a trained Shakespearean actress who had played in the English stage. And Katherine was fascinated by Marshall. He was, by that time, worldly, been around the world, Korea, Japan, Manchuria, all over the world, and experienced. They carried on an easy banter through dinner. I talked to a guy who was only 8 when he was there. Carried on an easy banter through dinner, and George learned that Katherine was the mother of 3, an older girl and 2 teenage sons, and that her husband was a lawyer like me, was murdered the year before in Baltimore by a very disgruntled a crazy client. So they spent the next day together at Benning, and she departed to her house on Calvert Street, Baltimore. They exchanged letters during the next year. And they saw one another at least once. And the subject of marriage was raised. Katherine decided to have a test to see whether marriage would work. So she invited George to spend a month with her and the two boys. The girl was off at school in Italy. With her and the two boys at their summer cottage on Fire Island. That's a little barrier island off the coast of Long Island. She had a summer cottage there. And her youngest son, Alan, he was 15 at the time, stepson of George later. Alan was 15. He was sensitive and very willful, probably of the three children most affected by his father's brutal murder. And he was resistant at first to the idea of Marshall coming up there, and thought, he would try to move in and replace his beloved father. But then he changed his mind, and he wrote a letter to Marshall. I do hope you will come to Fire Island. He wrote, don't be nervous. It's okay with me. A friend in need is a friend indeed. Signed, Alan. Well, Marshall was moved, deeply moved by his honesty, his vulnerability, and he would come to form a lifelong bond with Alan and treat him, he'd love him as if he was, his own son he never had. So after the month, actually it was 5 weeks at Fire Island, Katherine decided that the marriage would work. And I'm telling you, she was kind of in charge. And Marshall was overjoyed. In a letter to Pershing, listen, Pershing lost his own wife and 3 of his 4 children at a fire in the Presidio. He wrote a letter to Pershing. He was overjoyed, and he said, he exulted, I am going to acquire a complete family. This was so happy. And he asked Pershing to be his best man. So Pershing stood at Ramrod Straight Blackjack. Pershing stood at Marshall's side during his wedding to Katherine in Baltimore in 1930. So bear with me and let me flash forward more than a decade, well after the United States entered the Second World War, well after that, and well after Marshall was chief of staff of the entire Army for like three and a half years. It was June of 1943. Stepson Alan was itching to get into combat. Just graduated from the Fort Knox Tank School, wearing the bars of a second lieutenant. And Marshall had a reputation of never showing favoritism to any of his Army officers. But in Alan's case, he issued a highly unusual secret order, I discovered. And the order directed Alan to immediately join the veterans of the 1st Armored Division, who were refitting in Africa, June of 43, after Katherines, for action possibly in Italy. And Katherine, when she found out what her husband had done, was angry. And she let him know, and there's a letter to that effect. So Alan possibly going to Italy. Marshall had always believed that Italy was not the right place for the Americans to be taking on the Germans in force. In fact, a year earlier, summer of 1942, Marshall lost what John Keegan called the hardest fought strategic debate of the entire war involving the U.S. and the British. The outcome of his loss of that debate would be that there would be no invasion of Northwest France in 43, as Marshall and Eisenhower had fiercely advocated. There would be a buildup and an invasion in 43. That was their plan. But instead, because of the pressures by Winston Churchill and the orders by Commander-in-Chief Franklin Roosevelt, Marshall was ordered to move several of his divisions 2,000 to 3,000 miles south of England and France, invade French North Africa in the summer or fall of 42, not 43. And Marshall feared that once the American troops were in North Africa, they'd be sucked east, as he used to say, sucked east toward the eastern Mediterranean and eventually into Italy. That was his fear. And so, as a result of Churchill and Roosevelt's orders, Marshall's reluctant obedience to go into North Africa, stepson Allen would find himself fighting and slogging up the spine of Italy in the bitter winter of 43 and 44. Now, Marshall, as chief of staff, among other things he did all the time, was he followed Allen and his tank units, what they were doing in Italy, their action in Italy, and he got daily battle reports. He could follow what was going on. He also exchanged a lot of letters with Allen that are mostly in the Marshall Library, or some of those in that box that I found. So in the spring of 44, he knew where Allen was. And mid-May of 1944, General Mark Clark was about to break out of the Anzio beachhead in Italy. And Marshall knew that Allen and his tank units were about to see action big time. May 29, 1944, Marshall and George and Katherine were at home, still at home in quarters one, having breakfast. They were reading a letter that Allen had written several weeks before that they'd just received. In that letter, Allen wrote that he liked to talk about his luck. His luck had held at Monte Cassino. He was in the savage fighting in Monte Cassino. And that he expected to be home by Christmas 1944. A lot of them thought they would be home. The war would be over by Christmas 44. And that evening, this is the truth, Katherine had a dream, and she wrote about this dream in a letter to Allen's wife. He was married to a woman named Madge. In that dream, Katherine dreamt that she could see Allen as a toddler. She called him a flaxen-haired toddler at the top of a long stairway, darkened stairway at their house on Calvert Street in Baltimore. And he was calling to her, "Come get me." It's in the letter. The next morning, May 30, 44, day after the dream, Marshall arrived at the Pentagon, went into his office. He was handed a message from General Mark Clark. And the message said that the day before, the day that Katherine had her dream, Allen was killed while leading a tank platoon. It was his dream to lead that platoon on the road to Rome. He had stood, according to the reports, he had stood up out of his turret to take some German prisoners from the front who were waving a white flag, and he was ambushed or hit from the side. Somebody threw a grenade. German threw a grenade that exploded near his head. So Marshall emerged, according to the secretaries in the Pentagon, that he emerged from his office ashen-faced, called for his driver to take him home, slipped into Katherine's bedroom quietly and closed the door. Katherine wrote later that she felt a blessed numbness. She barely understood what Marshall was telling her. And there's no account of how Marshall felt, but it must have felt profound grief, and I suspect a tinge of regret at having made decisions, followed orders, and so forth that got Ellen into Italy in the first place. The last letter that Katherine wrote to Alan was returned unopened. And I was at the library going through, Katherine prepared all these scrapbooks during the war of all kinds of things that are in there were 8 or 9 scrapbooks, big things like that. And I was at the library, and I found that letter. It was pasted to one of the pages. I used to paste all this stuff on the pages, and so it was, by then it was opened, and I was wearing these gloves. You have to wear plastic gloves when you're handling these documents. And so I dipped my gloved hand into that envelope, pulled out these tissue-thin squares of V letters. They used to have these V letters stationary. And I could see her cursive handwriting in it. Near the end of the letter, she wrote about what she would do when Alan got home from the war. And the foods, the favorite foods she would fix him, and how they would sit out under the oaks at this house they had in Leesburg and talk about life. You know. At the very end of the letter, she said, "And I will love you, and you will be my baby boy once again." And across the front of the envelope, I mean, this is like so many people at that time got. Across the front of the envelope, the word "deceased" was stamped. So let me talk about character for a second. Finally, Marshall's character took shape at VMI when he was barely 20 years old. He actually entered VMI when he was 16. And there, as he wrote, he learned self-control. And he said discipline was ground into him. 40 years later, during the dark Valley Forge days, just after Pearl Harbor, January of 42, everything was going wrong. Marshall would take these winter walks with Katherine, January, February of 42, after he got back from Quarters 1, or after he got back from wherever he was that day. And Katherine wrote about what he would do. He would talk to himself as if he lived outside his body. He would say such things as, "I can't afford to get angry. I can't afford to appear tired." You got that from Pershing. "I can't allow myself the luxury of sentiment. Mine must be cold logic." And he was thinking about what he would be telling General MacArthur, about his troops being doomed. There's no way to rescue them in Bataan. Or how he had all these dear friends who wanted to lead combat troops, generals that wanted to lead he said, "You're too old, you've got to retire." And when he was 75 years old, he told in an interview that his hardest job in public life was controlling his temper. And there were some moments with Pershing in 1917 and Clifford and Truman in 1948 when he miserably failed to control his temper. Now, a conversation I was talking with, I think, General Remo early in the day, a conversation with Roosevelt in Cairo in December 1943. laid bare the essence of Marshall's character. Roosevelt beat around the bush, as he often did, but then he got to the point and he asked Marshall whether he wanted to command Operation Overlord. And Operation Overlord was regarded by the British and the Americans at that time. And the Operation Overlord was scheduled for early June of '44. And it was regarded by the British and the Americans before it happened as the decisive battle of the war, as far as they were concerned. And Marshall knew that, given his stature at the time, if he asked for the command, Roosevelt would almost certainly give it to him. But he didn't ask. He demurred, and he told the president that he needed to decide this matter, that he should feel perfectly free to decide the matter according to his best interests of the country, according to how he regarded the best interests of the country. And that he should not consider his, that is, Marshall's own feelings. And so Roosevelt concluded the affair, and he said to Marshall, well, I could not sleep at ease with you out of Washington. And that meant the command would go to General Eisenhower, his springboard to the presidency. Now, whether Marshall coveted that command, and many of his closest associates thought he did, or whether he felt it was in the best interest of the country for him to remain in Washington, where he could continue to influence the course of the global war. We'll never know the truth. There's no documentation one way or the other, just what some friends thought. But his refusal to express a desire one way or the other was utterly selfless. And Secretary of War Henry Stimson he was a lifelong Presbyterian. He found an apt proverb to express Marshall's selflessness in his character. He that ruleth his own spirit is better than he that taketh a city. Now, setting aside self-mastery and selflessness, another hallmark of Marshall's character was magnanimity. I have trouble with that word, magnanimity. It means high-minded or free of resentfulness. It was a Latin for great-souled, S-O-U-L-E-D. And when Truman was running, in the fall of 1948, when Truman was running for the presidency, in my judgment, Marshall lifted himself to the heights as a magnanimous leader. At the time, Marshall lifted himself to the heights as a magnanimous leader. At the time, Marshall was trapped in these endless negotiations in Paris with Soviet diplomats over the Secretary of State, over the Berlin crisis. And he learned in Paris that back in Washington, Truman was about to undermine him by sending an inexperienced envoy to Moscow. It was Fred Vinson on the Supreme Court. By sending an inexperienced envoy to Moscow to negotiate directly with Stalin. It was sort of an early version of what we know as the October surprise in the middle of an election. So Marshall could have resigned or threatened to resign, and some of his advisors recommended he do so. But he didn't. Instead, he thought of the pressures on Truman. And Truman was fighting against very long odds for that in that election. So he dashed off a radiogram or whatever to Truman I'm coming home. They said, no, I understand what's worrying you, Mr. President, and I'm coming home. I'm flying home immediately. And this, in my judgment, this was magnanimity on a grand scale, and it was kind of the code that he lived by. In my judgment, it was a mark of a really great man. They say that to test a man's character, give him power, and by gaining dominion over most, but certainly not all of his shortcomings, by any measure, Marshall passed the test. And let me just conclude by saying I need to check on this. By the time Marshall ended his public career in 1951, the pillars of his character, self-mastery, selflessness, magnanimity, candor, the capacity to love and be loved, were deeply etched. Because Marshall's character enabled him to accomplish great things, it mattered. It will never be replicated, but it needs to be remembered, if not emulated, by today's leaders. Thank you. Questions? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you need a microphone, yeah.
Well, good evening. My name is Hugh Hillman. I'm the commanding officer and director of the Center of Military History and Social Science in Germany.
Oh.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
It was very interesting due to the fact that George Marshall is very well known, of course, in Germany. We honored him with a stamp. This is not very often happened in Germany. I think only with JFK. With John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
But George Marshall was the first American being honored with a stamp in Germany. And so, first of all of you who have the possibility to stay and to plea for remaining and praying that the George C. Marshall Center will stay in Germany, please do so. Do everything that we will stay with the George Marshall Center.
That's in Garmisch?
Garmisch-Partenkirchen.
Yeah.
It's a nice area in Germany. However, I'm North German.
I'd like to speak there.
Yeah, you know this, I guess. Yeah. From a German perspective, of course, George C. Marshall is not a defender of the Republic. He is an enabler of the freedom for us Europeans and especially for the Germans. Well, but I have a very specific question.
Uh-oh.
And the question is, why?
Why?
Why did Marshall not agree on the questions of those who fought against Adolf Hitler at the 20th of July 1944? Why did he not say yes to freedom on one side and peacemaking on one side? Why did he continue the war against Nazi Germany?
Why did he continue?
Yes, in spite or despite the wishes of those who fought against Hitler and were killed at the 20th of July 1944. And why did he not agree on a specific freedom towards the West by those who did not like the Nazi regime?
I'm having trouble understanding that question. Why? I mean, you're asking him why he did not take action?
No, he just should have agreed, due to the fact that there were offers from those who fought inside Germany against Hitler.
Offers for
freedom, offers for peace towards the West. Why did he not agree and did not follow these ideas to make peace on the Western Front? and hinder millions stop killing people,
Right.
and especially
Why
killing
didn't they not do a deal?
and stop killing within the Holocaust.
Partly because, well, of course, it was Roosevelt's decision, not Marshall's. But of course, they had the unconditional surrender policy that Roosevelt announced at Casablanca, 1943. And of course, there was the ghost of Versailles. There was the fear that any kind of settlement short of complete unconditional surrender would possibly result in a revival, a resurgence of Nazism sometime, as if they once again they were stabbed in the back, as they thought during World War I. It was the key to the revival or the rise of Adolf Hitler. So I never ran across, even in any of my research, even that Marshall even thought about that. It was way above his pay grade, I would say, in terms of such a decision. And you're talking about what month was that? July of 44? Yeah, right. And I'd love to know if you've seen any further documentation. But of course, this was when Roosevelt was, failing, he had Admiral Leahy was probably as close to him as anybody in terms of the command structure then, and Marshall and Eisenhower, of course, were they were commanded to go all the way, unconditional surrender. But no one's ever asked me that question. It's very interesting. If you have any further perspective on that, whether there's any documentation, whether it even came across Roosevelt's mind or thinking at that time, I've never heard that. I never knew that it was even up. Stimson would be the one also to have probably brought it up if it became an issue, and I'm afraid I never saw that. It's a great question. Well, yeah.
How you doing? Very good talk on George Marshall, especially the personal aspects that we don't look at. We kind of see him as one of those figures that we see as a statue almost,
Right.
Some of the lions of history.
No statue in D.C.?
No, not yet. But for him, I thought when you were talking about his character, the interesting thing I thought about him in World War I is that he didn't have a problem questioning, a higher level, higher commanders,
Right.
like even Blackjack Pershing. He, offered constructive criticism,
Right.
which normally means you don't necessarily get promoted beyond
Right.
the field grade.
Right.
And then he did that with Fox Connor as well, over the taking of Sedan, because he
Right.
had to do that whole thing with the telephone.
He did it with
The
Roosevelt.
great technology of the era.
Right.
So where did that come from? Because in his training or his experience or just an instinct that, sometimes you have to question some of the commands, you have to question what's going on and make the right call.
Where did it come from? Listen, Marshall was confident. He was very self-confident. That's, he obviously had to have a hell of a lot of confidence in yourself. He had a sense of justice ingrained in him, and truth. And when he questioned Pershing, Pershing was criticizing Marshall's General Siebert, and Marshall, that struck him as unjust because it was mostly Pershing's headquarters' fault for all the training problems that they were having in the 1st Division. In the case of Roosevelt, when the only one in the room, packed room, the cabinet in the White House cabinet room, 1938, Marshall's a brigadier general sitting in the back, and Roosevelt says, here's what we need to do to deter Hitler. We need to produce 10,000 planes. He didn't say it at the time, but what he really wanted to do was to sell them to the British and the American, or the British and the French, to deter Hitler. And went around the room and got to Marshall and, don't you think so, George? And aside from the intimacy implied by the first name, Marshall got up and said, "No, Mr. President, I disagree with you." And I don't even think he got a chance to explain his reasoning, but his reasoning was, if you're going to do 10,000 planes, where are the pilots? Where are the air? What are we going to do? And there needs to be some balance. And at this point, he's got 189,000 in the Army or whatever. And then I think you had the conference with Hopkins. Hopkins basically interviewed Marshall for the Chief of Staff job after that. And we didn't really know what Roosevelt was thinking about him. But I think Hopkins convinced Roosevelt that this guy told the truth, that he had integrity, that he won't back down. And so there was a lazy Sunday in April of 1939 when Roosevelt called Marshall up to the Oval Study, that desk covered with stuff, and Roosevelt said to Marshall, by this time he was calling him George. I'm sorry, he was calling him General, excuse me, not calling him George. He said, General Marshall, I have it in mind, he said, to appoint you Chief of Staff. What do you think of that? And according to the stuff I've read, Marshall said, well, not that much, but I want to tell you that there will be moments if I do this, if you do this, when he said, it will be unpleasant. He didn't say it would be not pleasant. He said unpleasant, strange word, unpleasant. And Roosevelt sort of smiled and, didn't say it. And he said, no, I mean, it's not going to be pleasant. And I'm going to tell you the truth. No matter, whether you like it or not. And Roosevelt respected that. He saw integrity. He said, this guy's going to tell me the truth. He's not going to go behind my back. I trust him. And that was how it happened. And I love the part in the book that when Marshall didn't know where he stood with Roosevelt, he said Roosevelt took the best of a bad bargain by appointing him. And Marshall wasn't sure about Roosevelt's backbone either, because he was a wily politician. But a moment came when, in 1942, when the president of the Philippines, who was on Corregidor with General MacArthur, they were doomed. And the president of the Philippines wanted the U.S. to declare independence of its possession, the Philippines, so that Quezon could, basically convince the Japanese that, and the United States would pull out under some sort of a peace flag or whatever, and the Japanese would back down. In other words, we would have to declare independence of the Philippines, and Quezon thought he could maybe work out a deal if we did that. And that's when, I think Roosevelt rose to the heights in Marshall's judgment. He said, no, we can't do this. They're going to have to fight till the last man. We're not going to give away our possession. What will our allies think of us? And so it was a tremendously important decision. And from that point on, Marshall held Roosevelt in high esteem. He respected his political skills and his backbone.
Yeah. Colonel Kerger, Army, retired.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Take your time. I know. Yeah.
That might be a good segue into my question. Thank you for your talk and your book. I'm interested in the relationship between General Marshall and General Douglas MacArthur.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that Roosevelt and Churchill put Marshall in very awkward postures with regard to MacArthur on several different occasions, starting with the conferences that were held in Washington between Churchill and Roosevelt in December of '41, shortly after Pearl Harbor was bombed, when I think code name they used, Arcadia, was a decision that we would allow General MacArthur to continue to fight to the end if he could in the Philippines and turn our attention to Europe first.
Germany first, yeah.
And it was kind of tough, I think, on Marshall to put him in that position to be sort of deceptive to General MacArthur about the fact that he wasn't going to get resupplied by naval task force coming from the West Coast. And in fact, I think shortly into the beginning of 1942, there was a task force assembled on the West Coast, was ready with an armada of ships and supplies to go to the Philippines, and Churchill and Roosevelt decided no, and perhaps Roosevelt even suggested he would send it to Singapore instead. And that put Marshall in a position where he had to, I think, deceive MacArthur and let him fight to the end, and it ended up in the Bataan Peninsula, and then had to order him to go to Australia, which MacArthur said, no, I won't go unless the president tells me to do so, and further straining that relationship. Could you say a few words about the relation between the two men militarily and professionally?
I think that the most surprising part of my research and writing in the book was how deferential Marshall ended up being and magnanimous as well with regard to MacArthur. I mean, obviously MacArthur was not easy to deal with, but rightfully so. He felt he was stranded out there in the Pacific, and all the resources were going to Germany first. But the Germany first decision was made, and I think rightfully so, but it meant there just weren't enough resources to cover the globe, and somebody had to get short shrift, and it was MacArthur. MacArthur knew it. He complained about it constantly, and Marshall, Marshall could have relieved MacArthur right at the beginning of the war when MacArthur was caught losing all the B-17s with 9 hours advance notice that the Japanese were on their way. He easily could have, but Marshall felt that MacArthur was the best man in the East, clearly the most qualified, and he let him command. But you're right. I mean, Marshall. It wasn't for lack of trying in terms of trying to get supplies through or relief through, but the Japanese Navy was overwhelmingly, we were outgunned entirely. The only thing we had left were carriers. So he was in a difficult position, but Marshall got him a Congressional Medal of Honor, sort of, despite the fact that MacArthur didn't qualify really for the standards that were set for that at that time. But Marshall was an institutionalist too, and the reason why, because he believed in the Army, and MacArthur was the Army. I mean, he got 6 or 7 Silver Stars in the First World War. He was a hero, and he was a pretty brilliant commander in New Guinea, or at least he had good commanders that did very well in New Guinea with very little. So Marshall never talked about how difficult it was, with MacArthur. I couldn't find any interview reports. All I know is what he did for MacArthur. And right after, being, not getting the Overlord command, or when that decision was made, instead of going back to Washington, Marshall flew 10, 12,000 miles the other way to meet MacArthur on a little island off the coast of New Guinea, to assure him that we're getting him everything we can possibly get. But he explained, the problems of supplying the entire globe. But he went out there and went through Japanese airspace to get to him. And he was, there are a lot of people that say that Marshall had harbored anger or whatever toward MacArthur. He may have, but I'm telling you, he did everything he could, and it was surprising, particularly in the fact that MacArthur made Marshall's life miserable because he was complaining all the time, and the deference he showed in terms of firing MacArthur was also unusual. In terms of he was the last man below Truman to basically say, yeah, he's got to go, Marshall delayed speaking to that until all the other Joint Chiefs had said, yeah, he has to go. Truman had already made up his mind. But I was saying during the podcast earlier, when MacArthur was away from the United States for more than 10 years, I believe, since the 30s, he incidentally got paid, $500,000 in those dollars today, many millions of dollars by Kazan, and he took that money, so he was wealthy after Corregidor. I don't know whether Marshall knew about that until later, but when MacArthur came back to the United States in 1951, having been relieved of command, landed in San Francisco, then New York, or in Washington National Airport. He came down the gangway from the plane wearing his, trademark scrambled eggs, crushed hat, and Marshall was there on the tarmac, and MacArthur looked over at Marshall and said, "Hello, George." So it was. I just thought that was an amazing moment. Anyway, do you want? Yeah. Sorry to take so long.